All right. So, Dr. Demartini, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You know, we were just on a set for your upcoming movie called The Breakthrough, and we talked a lot. And there was so many residual leftover questions that I had because I really wanted to pick your brain on various subjects. So, just to jump right in, as you know, I'm a 23-year practicing chiropractor. I'm still seeing patients part time, and the rest of the time I'm coaching. And I think a hot topic, I mean, there's always so many topics, but a pressing and I don't know, I think a very relevant topic for my clientele, my patient base, would be how your perceptions, how your thoughts, how your mind impacts your, your psychology, how it impacts your biology, and how it potentially leads to dis-ease and full-blown disease. So please just go ahead and just try to tear that apart. I know there's a lot to unpack there.
Okay. Unquestionably, there is no change in perception without a change in physiology. And any health practitioner that does not acknowledge the psychology underlying various forms of somatization and physical illness, to me, is overlooking an obvious correlation. And I'm amazed that still there are those practitioners and professionals that have not really studied applied physiology, which I think is robbing people of giving them their power back in their own health. So, how do perceptions affect physiology? There are two forms of distress that people face, only two. The perception of loss of that which they seek, and the perception of gain of that which they try to avoid.
So attracting the negative. Right. There's a little delay there.
Let's say that the very, very core subcortical deep nuclei in the front of the brain is involved with survival. Okay. And it wants prey, and it wants to avoid predator. It wants to consume and eat prey. It wants satiation of prey, and it wants to be away and get away from a predator that's going to eat it. So the fear of loss of that which it's seeking, prey, is starvation, which can lead to death. And the fear of gaining predator is being eaten, which can lead to death. So those are the two most primitive forms of distress that a human being can face, an animal for that matter can face. So anything that supports our values, what we value most, anything that enhances and supports it, is perceived as prey in our brain. And anything that challenges our values is perceived as predator. So let's say that people paying you for a service, you seek that, so you fear its loss. You fear the loss of you fear not getting paid for your service, or you're afraid of getting bills that's unexpected. Those are distressful. All forms of distress boil down to the perception of loss of that which you're seeking, prey, and the perception of gaining of that which you're trying to avoid, predator. So the first idea of the psychosomatic relationship is that anything that supports our values, we're going to fear the loss of, and we're going to be seeking the gain of. And anything that challenges our values, we're going to be seeking the avoidance of, and we're going to try to avoid it happening. So any perception, sight, sound, smell, taste, any form of perception that we have that's a perception of loss of that which we seek, or a perception gain that we avoid, is a distress that causes illness. Now, let me give you an example. We have an autonomic nervous system branched into two branches, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. The parasympathetic is for rest and digest. It wants to eat the prey. The sympathetic is for fight or flight. It wants to avoid the predator. So our autonomic nervous system automatically comes onto activity and online the moment we're perceiving a loss of that which we're seeking or the gain of that which we're trying to avoid. That creates the sympathetic response. If we perceive the gain of what we're seeking and the avoidance of what we're trying to avoid, we get the parasympathetic side. So our perceptions initiate, because of our value systems and our survival parts of our brain and our autonomics, create a parasympathetic sympathetic response. Now, the parasympathetic and sympathetic response goes to every cell pretty well throughout the body. So, for instance, if you have a gastrointestinal goblet cell which secretes mucus in the intestines, the parasympathetic system causes mucus secretion, digestive serous fluids, when all of a sudden you perceive something supporting your values. If you see something challenging your values or something taken away that you're seeking, it activates the sympathetic system and shuts down the digestive system. But at the same time, the musculature on the peripheral part of the body, the sympathetic brings blood and activity to those for fight or flight. So the blood goes from the digestive organs to the muscles when you're under sympathetic and you're perceiving a loss of that which you seek or the gain of what you're trying to avoid. And it goes from the somatic musculature into the digestive system when you're seeking, getting what you seek and avoiding what you're trying to avoid. So the autonomics are activated based on these perceptions. Now, if you set an unrealistic expectation, don't get it met, the sympathetic comes on. If you set a realistic expectation, get it met, the parasympathetic comes on. So every perception you have is based on your values and expectations that you have in your mind. Now, the autonomics, they make every cell turn on or turn off. So the goblet cells are turned on by the parasympathetic and turned off by the sympathetic. The heart rate goes up under sympathetic and goes down under parasympathetic. The lungs, they dilate the tubules, you might say, the bronchioles, they get dilated under sympathetic and constrict under parasympathetic. So every symptom of the body is impacted by the autonomics, which are impacted by the perceptions that we hold and the values that we have. So right. Our values underlying every illness, our perceptions underlying every illness, our autonomics are underlying the illnesses. And so if we change our perceptions, change our expectations, balance them and set realistic expectations, we calm down many illnesses. Now, I was working on an illness just 2 hours ago, and it was on blindness, optical blindness, caused by papilledema, where the papillae musculature in the optic area of the eye is automatically undergoing edema. So what happens is the sympathetic nervous system makes the blood pressure go up and blood sugar go up for fight or flight. When it does, the perfusion of blood into the brain goes up, the intracranial pressure goes up. That causes papilledema in the eye because of the cerebral spinal fluid is now increased. That causes the eye to be now under swelling. That causes a compression on the optic nerve and eventually can cause blindness. It's chronic. So chronic stress can cause literally a gradual degeneration of the eye. Now, if the stress is the perception of not getting what you see you want, let's say you have a vision of how you want your life to look, the way you want to look in body tone or shape, or maybe you have a goal that you want to, it looks a certain way, or the way you want to play to travel somewhere. Whatever the objective is, if it's unrealistic for the strategy and you have distress because you're not getting what you're looking for, you feel you've lost what you're looking for, the sympathetic can cause this increase in heart rate, increase in blood pressure. Hypertension is a sympathetic dominant system, from anger from not meeting expectation. This also causes the intracranial pressure to go up and can lead to blindness because you can't see how you're going to get what you want. And it affects your eyes, for instance. So these are classical psychosomatic results, and a somatization of the psyche, the expectations and perceptions show up in the body. Now, if we don't know what those symptoms really represent from a psychological perspective, we're going to treat them for various allopathic approaches.
Mhm.
But if we actually understand applied physiology, we can ask questions, help people get realistic expectations, come up with strategies on how to achieve things, not feel you're losing things that you think you're seeking, and not feel like you're gaining things that you're resenting by using what I call the Demartini method to balance the perceptions. The physiology automatically comes back into balance, and we have, quote, wellness. The symptoms of our body are giving us feedback of what's going on in our minds. Our body is creating symptoms to try to guide us back to a balanced perception where we have a homeostasis and wellness and authenticity.
So is what you're saying that not only are these imbalances between your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, not only are they the driving forces for symptoms, but you can look at pretty much every human disease and break it down into either sympathetic or parasympathetic dominant?
I don't want to say it that way because some diseases are combinations. You can have a sympathetic, you see, every time we have a perception that's imbalanced, and let's say we meet somebody, a beautiful girl, you're a guy, you see a beautiful girl, or maybe you're a guy looking for a guy, I don't know. But whatever it is that you see something you attract to, and you seek it, and you feel that, wow, I'm infatuated with that. I'm perceiving and conscious of the upsides, and I'm unconscious of the downsides while I'm infatuated. And now I got a parasympathetic response. I want to consume it and eat that thing, you might say.
Yep, literally.
You got a parasympathetic dominance.
Mm-hmm.
During that moment, you could also, all of a sudden, because of that infatuation, have a fear of loss. So you can have a parasympathetic thing you're searching for, but at the same time, the fear of loss of it can come. Depending on which one of those dominate at that moment, the fear of loss of it or the idea I'm about to get it can change that physiology in seconds. I mean, our chemistry, neurochemistry is changing second by second. Now, let's say that we found out that the person we're now infatuated with, we find out that all of a sudden the ex-husband comes around. And we don't like that because that guy could come back and we could be jealous, we could be hurt, we could be distracted, he could be aggressive. So we may simultaneously be infatuated and fear the loss of this individual. We may also have a resentment to this individual, and those combinations will create certain symptomatology. That the one infatuation will create a different symptomatology. But we store in our subconscious mind all the memories, you might say, in the past of all imbalanced perceptions. It's stored in our subconscious mind. And the accumulation of those imbalanced perceptions in various combinations lead to certain psychological, physiological, quote, symptomatology. I don't want to always label it illness because I think that many of the things we've labeled illness is actually wellness. It's basically the body doing its job to make us aware of what we haven't balanced, to give us a chance to balance, creating symptoms that we think we want to get rid of because we live in an allopathic idea that getting rid of symptoms is healthy. But symptoms are not necessarily illness. Symptoms can be a healthy response. Anybody that's gone out and overeaten, I mean pigged out and been a little oinker, and the next morning they got cramps, bloat, gas, maybe a bit of a headache, a little nausea, a little fatigue. Those symptoms are not illness. Those are symptoms, are feedback, homeostatic feedback responses to let you know that your behavior was based on an assumption that you can eat more than you really can, and that you have now overeaten because of some emotion. And it's trying to create symptoms to guide you back to a wise action. It's letting you know that doesn't work. That pigging out is not a wise action. If you don't pig out, the symptoms go away. If you all of a sudden eat light the next 3 days, you don't have symptoms. They go away. So the symptoms aren't your enemy. The symptoms not your disease. The symptoms are your friends if they're interpreted properly and you know the correlation.
Right. That's an important point, is for people to understand that symptoms are intelligent feedback systems to help guide their mind and guide their life and their behaviors. and their
Yes,
decisions.
to guide their perceptions, to make sure that they're see, we have a set of values and priorities in life. When we live by our highest priorities and most highest priority values, we are most objective, we're most spontaneous, we're most authentic, because our highest value is what our identity revolves around. Whenever we do, we're more objective, more neutral, and have realistic expectations and achieve what we set out to. So we have the least amount of symptoms needed. But if we try to live by lower values because we compare ourselves to others and we think, oh, we should be somebody we're not, and we hear ourselves saying, I should be, I ought to be, I need to be, I got to be, I have to be, I must, to be something other than what you really are, your body in lower values activates the amygdala instead of the executive area of the brain. And it creates this polarization, and it creates subjective bias, and it creates imbalanced expectations and distortions of perception. Almost all the illnesses are survival perceptions, creating symptoms misinterpreted and not knowing how to ask the questions to bring it back into balance. That's why I put my Demartini method together to try to help people who have these symptomatologies, psychological imbalance perceptions, how to ask questions to bring them back into balance. And the moment they do, many of the symptoms disappear. They just go away because they're not needed as a feedback anymore.
So, John, when you're speaking about, these two like primary, if you will, you called it distresses, right? The acquiring that which you resent and the losing that which you infatuate with, or you said it in seek and avoid. But are we talking stress, or are we talking fear? And is fear a component of stress? Is fear driving stress? How would you kind of untangle that a little bit?
No problem. I want you to imagine a magnet. Okay, a positive pole of a magnet here and a negative pole of a magnet there. This isn't a magnet, this is an eye pen or whatever. But let's imagine that's a magnet. The positive pole you seek, the negative pole you try to avoid. Okay, so the seeking pole you think you can get, but if you cut the magnet in half, you find out that you have a positive and negative no matter what, and if you cut it in half, you get a negative and positive no matter what. So searching for that which is unobtainable, the positive pole, and trying to avoid that which is unavoidable is a source of human suffering, because it's not going to happen. You're not going to get a positive without a negative. You're not going to get a negative without a positive. Many people think when they get in a new relationship and they're infatuated, I finally found somebody that's now got more positives and negatives. But as the days go on and the weeks go on, you eventually discover that individual's got just as many downsides as upsides. And you then have to decide whether or not you're really ready to love somebody for both sides and to unconditionally love them for both sides, instead of keep seeking for a one-sided individual that's never going to happen. Now, when you seek it, we call it philia. When we're afraid of it, we call it phobia. Phobia or fear is the assumption you're about to experience more negatives than positives in the future through your imagination or your senses. And philia is an assumption you're going to experience more positives and negatives in the future through your imagination or your senses. So every time you have a philia that you think you're going to get a positive or negative, you're going to have a fear of loss of it. And every time you have a phobia, you're going to have a fear of gain of it. So you cannot have philia and phobia without a fear. There's no way, as long as you have any polarity, you have philia and phobia. So there's two types of fears: the fear of loss of that which you seek and the fear of gain of that which you're trying to avoid. The two fears are the two distresses. They're identical. So you cannot have it. Now, if you're infatuated, the more you fear their loss. The more you resent them, the more you fear their gain. And if you resent them and you have a phobia of them being around, you have a fantasy of escaping them. It's relief. It's grief to be exposed to the thing you resent or have phobia of, but it's a relief to get away from it. But it's also a relief to gain what you're philic about and a grief to lose it. So you cannot have relief without grief. They're inseparable from each other. They're always paired, just like philia and phobia, just like positive, negative, just like any polarity. As Heraclitus said in the 5th century BC, you can't separate the inseparables. Kipling called them imposters. They're delusions, one side without the other. In the universe, there's a complete pair of balance between positives and negatives that are conserved through time and space. We can't separate these two, but our amygdala wants to. Our amygdala wants to avoid the predator and seek to prey. It's living in an illusion of survival. And under an emergency, we try that, but we can't live our life that way. You're never going to get rid of positives and negatives in life. So the very searching for one side makes the fear of its loss, and the very avoidance of the other side makes the fear of gain. So fear and distress are inseparable. You can't separate the two.
Right. And I mean, you can separate positive and negative in your mind. You can separate it in time, because that's what people do, right? They're chasing some fantasy because they're assuming they're going to get some positive or negative. But once they arrive there, or maybe looking back at one point, they're going to realize that they never had the positive or the negative all along.
Well, that's the thing. See, the wisdom of the ages can occur through time or can be seen immediately. If you're wise, you see that each individual has positive negatives. Look at all the heroes that we thought in our world, you know, the Oscar Pistorius, the Lance Armstrongs, you know, the Bill Cosbys or whatever, that we thought, oh, these are really good people or whatever. There is no such thing as a one-sided individual. There is no hero without a villain. There is no saint without a sin. There is no virtue without a vice. To search for one-sided is just futile. And to assume that somebody's going to be one-sided means you have ignorance. Ignorance is the ignoring half of what's there. That's what ignorance is. When you're infatuated with somebody, you're ignoring the downsides. When you're resentful, you're ignoring the upsides. When you're philic, you're ignoring the phobias. When you're phobic, you're ignoring the philias. They're inseparable. It's only in the mind, what I call the lower mind, the subjective bias mind of the amygdala, that we separate those and divide those and label those and name those and try to divide those. Our executive function understands objectively that both. Objectivity means neutral. Now, if you're completely neutral, you don't fear the gain of it or loss of it, right? If it's positive, you fear its loss. If it's negative, you fear its gain. If it's neutral, it can come and go. And that's what the Buddha was calling the non-attachment state. When you have no attachment, if you're infatuated, you have an attachment, you fear its loss. If you have a resentment, you fear its gain. Those are attachments. When you're completely objective, completely neutral, and have an unconditional love, you transcend. And you also stop the illness, the symptoms, or the wellness feedback, because it's neutral. Your body is under homeostasis. Claude Bernard and Walter Cannon, both great Harvard professors in physiology, in his book, The Wisdom of the Body by Walter Cannon, he says that you're perturbed by your misperceptions of your senses. But inside you, you have tremendous amount of feedback systems and homeostatic mechanisms to keep the internal milieu balanced. Now, if you're wise, you don't allow the lopsided perceptions in the world to run you. Whenever you see something you think's got positive, you immediately look for the negatives, and your intuition is trying to point them out. And if you see negatives, your intuition is trying to point out the positives. That's why if you're infatuated with some guy, a girl is, she's going to immediately think, too good to be true. Keep your eyes open. Watch out. He's probably a player. And if you have this event in your life, there must be a purpose behind this. There must be meaning to this. There's got to be a reason why this is happening. We automatically, intuitively are trying to find that homeostasis. And we have both introceptive and extroceptive, internal and external sensory systems leading us to homeostasis. If we're wise and we're living in our executive function, living by our highest values, we have the most homeostasis and we have eustress. We embrace both sides of life simultaneously, and we're neutral. And there we're not touched. We're not run by the external world. We're run from within. And those that run from within are leaders. Those that are run from without are followers in life.
So, John, you painted a very clear picture about how our perceptions can impact our, quote, illness, our dis-ease, our disease. So what about people who, for example, have a traumatic injury? Well, they say, you know, I'm not stressed about anything. I wasn't afraid of anything. I just picked up a barbell and I was trying to do a deadlift and all of a sudden I hurt my back. Or it's my posture. I'm sitting at the computer and it's just my posture is wrong. That's why I have neck issues and that kind of thing. How how would you answer the question of, does your perceptions, do your perceptions impact trauma?
Yes. Well, trauma by definition is simply a lopsided perception. That's all.
And I mean physical
Let me give
trauma.
you an example. Yeah, but that's not. I had a gentleman who was driving down a highway, a freeway in Johannesburg. He owned a big company. He was very wealthy, and he was in a very nice car.
Okay.
All of a sudden, 4 cars came up, 2 on the side, 1 in front of him, 1 behind him, and stopped him on the freeway. Men got out with masks, covers, with machine guns, and came and surrounded his car. Banged open the window because he locked the doors and windows, knocked him out, opened the door, grabbed him out of the car. 2 guys took him and put him in a trunk, shut the thing, covered up his head with a thing to not see. Left his car on the freeway and drove for 5.5 hours to the middle of nowhere. Now, his psychologist called that a post-traumatic stress response, what he had. But let me explain something here. That's what most people fall for, because they have a moral hypocrisy about what's good and bad and what's right and wrong and what's kind and cruel already in their mind, that the perceptions and expectations are sitting there. That's not a very nice thing. That's a cruel thing. So I'm now traumatized. So months go by, pardon me, 5 weeks go by, 5.5 weeks go by, and they ask for a very large sum of money. We're talking about millions. Or he's going to have his family killed. So it's either the money or death of his family.
Okay.
So he decided to pay. He didn't have anybody negotiating. He didn't have anything. It was just him. He figured, I'd rather have all that than and lose some millions and just rebuild it, because he knew he could. But he would perceive this as traumatic because they literally hurt him as they did this and put him in there. And imagine 5.5 hours without peeing or pooing in the back of a car with some fumes in the back. Now, they released him after they got the money. And he was traumatized in his mind, diagnosed as post-traumatic stress, anxiety disorder, another label, and wasn't able to work.
And as a victim, of course.
And now victim of this outer circumstance. That's what he came to me. Now, this had gone on for months and still under that diagnosis by an incompetent professional, in my opinion. And I might as well just say it like it is, because that person doesn't know what they're doing. So they were sent to me finally. I didn't know this guy, but somebody referred to me. I got him on the Zoom. And he says the whole story. I said, all right, stop the story. Dramatizing the story is not going to do anything. It's just going to run the story. So let's change the story. Go to the moment when they actually picked you up, grabbed you, and put you in the trunk. Great. At that moment that you thought was traumatic and dark and scary and didn't know what was happening and thought you were going to lose your life and lose your business and family and everything else, go to that moment. Go into that moment. And he did. I said, at that moment, you cannot have tragedy without comedy. You cannot have torture without ecstasy. The mind has a homeostatic mechanism and will create a dissociation freeze response and automatically create an anti-memory, anti-content mind manifestation, you might call it. And it's there. I've done hundreds and hundreds of these cases like this. And at that moment, I asked him, so at the moment when you feel you're being tortured, where was the ecstasy? And he said, wow, now that I'm in the moment, I'm realizing what my mind is doing. And my mind dissociated from that and was in a field holding hands with my kids and my wife, running through freely in a field in a sunny, clear, fresh, refreshing, beautifully smelling. Instead of this fumes,
Smell,
it's
yeah.
now fresh. Instead of dark, it's now light. Instead of feeling like I'm going to lose my family, I'm with my family. Instead of feeling constrained, I'm running free and there's butterflies and birds.
This is like
And he goes, I can't believe it.
right?
Pardon me?
Like this is the mind, as you're about to say, the psychology maintaining balance and equilibrium as a self-preservation mechanism. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's exactly what's doing. It's a homeostatic anti-memory generation to take the electronics and the neurotransmitters and to get them back into homeostasis. Now, most people don't know this, and they just put a label on it and then get treated by a psychiatrist, give them a drug, and go home and get on drugs.
Right.
It's
and John,
insane.
they wouldn't have even, if that guy went in for antidepressants, for example, or whatever they're going to give him to treat the post-traumatic stress disorder, they wouldn't even
He was
test.
on antidepressants.
Yeah, but they wouldn't even check to see if there's any, if there's any imbalance, right? It's not like
No, they're just going to assume under the old model that they have a biochemical imbalance. That's what's crazy, which has already been proven to be a bit of a farce. Yeah. So what happens is I showed him in his mind at that moment the two sides simultaneously. And that's called simultaneous contrast. And the moment you do, the trauma of that split second is no longer there. And what I did is I went through his stream of consciousness and I took each moment that he thought was traumatic and I showed him the ecstatic opposite and made him become aware intuitively of what was there simultaneously, put him in the awareness of both, and both popped. There was no elation, no depression. It was just, he saw that at the moment his mind was actually stable and centered, and he had stored in his subconscious mind consciously the trauma, but unconscious was the ecstasy. And I did each of those moments that he thought were traumatic, when all of a sudden they're banging the window and the so-called window cracks and breaks. And he's now feeling like he's got no control. I took him back to that moment and found out where he had control. He believed he had superpower and he was ready to tackle the guys. Now they didn't have the power, but in his mind, he thought of all these different things he's going to do to tackle these guys. There were superpowers. Superpowers are compensation for feeling powerless that the mind sets up. Everybody out there has moments when they imagine themselves able to fly or live through a plane crash or some sort of a superpower. Those are only in the mind at the moments we're feeling that we have no solution to something we feel powerless to deal with. Our mind is creating these things in a dissociation freeze response in mild or moderate degrees or extremes in some cases. So I took him through that and then asked him what were the benefits of those experiences and what were the drawbacks of the ecstatic experiences. And I brought those into balance. And he couldn't see any benefits to the event. I said, so what's the benefit of the event? He goes, I can't see any benefits. I said, great. What's the benefits of the event? I don't know. Go and look again. You stopped and told me you don't know within 1 second of me asking, which means you didn't even try to look. Let's look at what the benefits are. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden he said, he got one. He said, I've never been closer to my family and children and wife in the history of my marriage. And while my business was busy and booming, I almost took them for granted. And times I wasn't even thinking about them or appreciating them. I'm now appreciating my family like you have no idea, because they were in my mind while I was in this situation more than anything in my mind. I said, so you got closer to your wife. I said, what's that worth? And I put a dollar value on the worth of that because there was a certain amount of money that they ransomed out of him. So how much did you gain for that so-called loss? And he put a high value on it because he said, well, that would have been a divorce and that's half my fortune. Right. I said, great. So what was the value of that? And then he said, on the next benefit, he said, I had been trying to get my staff in my business to take more accountability and take on roles and responsibilities, but I wasn't even aware that I kept interfering with it by me doing it. Mm-hmm. When I disappeared for 5.5 weeks and I came back, my business boomed. Everybody rose to the occasion and took on responsibilities and figured we don't know what we got to run the business. And all the people that I was hoping would take command did. And I said, so what's that worth? He said, we had the biggest month while I was gone, the biggest in 5.5 weeks. We had the most income, the biggest month in my business. And I said, how much did you make? More than the ransom.
Wow. Get
I said, so what you're saying is that these guys in the ransom were professional consultants trying to get you to be closer to your family and to grow your business more efficiently?
That's
He
right.
started chuckling, goes, yeah. I said, so what's another benefit? He said, I'm now able to be at home with my family. I lost weight while I was there. My weight is down. I had hypertension. I had I was gained weight. I was out of control. I was working my ass off. I wasn't seeing my family. I was on the verge of divorce. I was on the verge of hypertension. I got my health back. I'm doing all kind of interesting stuff, yoga and all kind of things with my wife now. We're walking. We're eating wiser. I've lost a bunch of weight. I've got my health back. I've got my business booming. I got my family back. I'm working less hours and I'm making more income. I said, now, if you ran a trajectory projected in the next few years, what that is compared to the cost of this, insignificant compared to the cost of the ransom. What was a lot to these people was insignificant, really.
Yeah, it was a
even though it was
consultant.
millions of dollars. I said, could a consultant ever have got you this outcome? He said, I had consultants and mentors and coaches. I never got that outcome.
Man.
Anyway, I just kept asking for the benefits of what happened, and the drawback of it had never happened. Because sometimes we compare our current reality to a fantasy of how it should have been, could have been, would have been, and then we're not appreciating the way it is. And I balanced that equation out in 2 hours. 2 hours. And there was the distress was gone, the label was gone, the post-traumatic stress was gone, the pharmacology was over, the appreciation was there. And he thought, I feel like I'd like to go to those guys and say, thank you. You gave me my life back. And what was interesting is inside him, intuitively, he was trying to solve these puzzles. How do I not lose my family? How do I keep my business? How do I get people to work? Everything that he was looking for came to fruition because of that event. Every event in our life is a feedback mechanism to help us become more authentic and more efficient in our actions. Now, that was labeled traumatic. That was diagnosed traumatic. That was pharmacologically treated traumatic. Bullshit. Pardon me for just saying it like it is. I see this every day almost working with people, and they get labels instead of actually know how to master their life and transform their perceptions and decisions and actions. So is there trauma out there? I don't know. I have yet to see something that can't be neutralized. Yet to see that. I had a guy 3 days ago, $5 billion crash in his economics. An entire financial home collapsed. We're talking about a massive multi-billion-dollar business just building buildings, and his net worth was $5 billion, crashed.
Trauma.
Yeah. No, it wasn't. Not when we got through. He says it saved him his life. It saved him potential prison. It saved him from doing drugs. It saved him from having multiple divorces. It saved him for all kinds of things.
Right.
And we
So
put a
just
value on it. He says, I didn't lose a thing. I gained my life.
right. So these are just events that we mislabel, just like we mislabel our illnesses and misperceive pretty much relationships.
All events are neutral. All events are neutral until you have a narrow enough mind to subjectively bias your interpretation of reality.
Mm.
And
Incredible.
that's where moral hypocrisies breed that. Moral hypocrisies, mainly from some sort of religious origin or political origin in most cases. See, masters let their physiology and psychology offer them feedback, and they subtly pick it up before it becomes enormous. And masses, the people that are caught and controlled by other people instead of governed from within, they have to be governed from without by politics and religions in most cases that use moral hypocrisies to control them because they can't control themselves.
Mm-hmm. Did you hear about, so I want to just shift gears because we talked about trauma, and I want to shift gears to physical trauma because something just happened a couple of days ago. I don't know if you heard about this on Sunday Night Football. where a Buffalo Bills, one of the football players, he tackled someone and stood up and then just fell right back and was in cardiac arrest, I think, for 8 minutes or 10 minutes or something like that. So everyone's saying that there could be an arrhythmia, it could be some sort of cardiac dysfunction, it could be trauma to the chest. It wasn't, they were sure it wasn't some sort of spinal cord injury because he wouldn't be able to stand right up, of course. But so in our focus here about physical traumas, like somebody, picks up a dumbbell and then hurts their shoulder, or somebody gets hit in football like this gentleman and now is, in ICU. How do you, because most people, they don't even want to consider that there's energy in motion while they're physically in motion, right? They don't even want to consider that. They want to consider it as a pure, I just had a guy today, fell off his 4x4. He's doing a catwalk, like on 2 wheels, and he fell backwards. And sometimes they just don't even want to go into the space, the head space. They want to say, look, this is a pure physical thing. What do you have to say to that?
You just said a really good one. I have had thousands of people attend my programs, as you know, and sometimes I ask them to do a little favor for me. I ask them to go to the most traumatic moment of their life where they've had an injury or some sort of a trauma that they labeled a devastating event. I have them write down where it was, when it was, and what it was. And then once they're there, I ask, now at that moment, you either were cocky, arrogant, feeling invincible, elated, or manic. Which one was it? Across the room, I'll get 100% response. They'll go, oh my God. I said, these are not random accidents. These are homeostatic mechanisms to keep people who are proud and cocky and manic back down into authenticity. Because we start to think we're invincible. You just described the guy that did the 4x4, whatever, and he was on 2 wheels. So what's that tell you? He's exaggerating and showing off a skill that's being exaggerated at that moment when he has his trauma. I don't know what the football player is, but you will not find an accident, an injury without a jury from within. There's some form of judgment within initiating this. We found out in a book called Sports Injuries. Sports Injuries, they found out that if an individual is feeling cocky because they just did a play that's really good, they have a higher probability of injuring themselves on the next turn, on the next play. The same thing as a person that's in golf, if they're highly cocky, they think, wow, what a shot. I'm amazing. I'm ahead of everybody. That's when they have usually some sort of injury, or that's when they end up really screwing up on a slice or a hook or something.
Right.
So we have what is called a licensing effect. The second we allow ourselves to go into pride, we allow ourselves to do something that brings us into shame to bring us back into homeostasis. That's why people that feel like they work out and they've done a great workout, they now give themselves permission to eat more chocolate or more wine or do something that's unhealthy to counterbalance it. We have homeostatic mechanisms. And the second we're above equilibrium, we attract tragedy to bring us back down. And the second we're below equilibrium, we attract support and comedy to lift us up. That's why people that are down and depressed, people try to lighten them up. And people that are cocky, they get the tall poppy syndrome and they get brought down. But we do it internally within our own physiology and psychology without realizing it. So unless you ask the right questions to unveil what these are, you'll think they're random events. But there's a hidden order in the apparent chaos. That's my specialty, asking the questions to reveal the hidden order to why you've created the dynamic you have in order to get you to be authentic. Because when you're puffed up, that's not authentic. When you're beat down, that's not authentic. It's only when you're centered are authentic. And every symptom in our body is trying to get us authentic.
So in this example, we talked about the 4x4 and the football injuries. We talked about pride before the fall, this hubris, so to speak. So going to their elated state, right? You made a clear connection between their trauma and a state of elation, pride, arrogance, all that kind of stuff that you mentioned. That elated state, would you also look at the fact that it's a compensation for something that they're ashamed of, feel guilty of, not proud of, that sort of thing?
You can't have one without the other. By doing the Demartini method, there is no such thing as pride without shame, but you're conscious of one, that's when you're proud, and you're unconscious of your shame. We have a U.S. former president that's living that right now. That cocky, arrogant pride, invincibility is attracting tremendous amount of tragic events to try to bring him back into equilibrium.
Mhm.
So if he doesn't get the lesson, he'll have to learn by the tragedy to humble him. But that's nature. That's what nature does. When all of a sudden you humble yourself, people lift you up. If I walk in a room and somebody says, "Oh, Dr. Demartini, you're a really amazing guy," or whatever, and starts praising me, and I walk in there and I lower it and I humble myself, I said, "Well, thank you, but talk to my girlfriend. She has a different view." And I minimize myself lower than what you perceive me to be. You'll keep lifting me up. But if I walk in that room and you say, "Oh, Dr. Demartini, you're amazing," or something, and I go, "You have no idea how amazing I am. I'm more amazing than your little brain can comprehend," and you get arrogant, they'll immediately cut you down.
100%.
And just like other people do that in society, you do that to your own physiology and psychology without realizing it, to get you back into homeostasis. Everything's striving for equanimity within us and equity between us.
100%. Yeah, you see that often with professional speakers. If you come on stage and you're cocky and arrogant, you're going to get slammed. And if you're humble and you're sharing stories of where you fell flat on your face, then you can instantly connect. You connect with the group. So there's no doubt about
That's
that.
it. Yeah, there's a fine line that's the authentic you. When you do, you speak from your heart and you get a standing ovation. Not out of elation, not out of depression, not out of looking up to you or looking down on you, but because they can identify with the authenticity and they rally around it.
Right. It's like you're speaking from the heart. The authentic.
What's interesting is the brain has, when you're in the executive center, the brain has fibers that go into the hypothalamus that then go to the autonomics and then go to the intracardiac network and then bring homeostasis to bring the sinoatrial node into its pacemaker so there's no arrhythmias. But if you're into extreme elation or depression, it goes not to the intercardiac reflexes, it goes now down to the enteric reflexes where gut impulse and instinct are. And when you do, you have arrhythmic responses in physiology. You get either over-digestive or under-digestive. And these lead to, overeating, undereating, or over-secretion, under-secretion, or dryness, constipation, diarrhea. All the symptoms in our physiology are letting us know when we're authentic or not. It's just a feedback system. Now, even microorganisms, the microbiome is changing based on the autonomics, and the microorganisms can go one way or the other and then become out of control. So we could actually trace, infectious diseases, traumatic illnesses, psychological illnesses to perceptions. And to me, it hasn't been emphasized. You know why? Economics. Very simple. The doctor can go in and spend 2 or 3 minutes with you, write a script, and off to the next patient. It takes conversations and questioning, and not everybody's willing to pay that for a conversation because most people, even in psychology, don't know how to ask the right questions. They're trying to make them happy and not sad, which is futile, instead of helping them be authentic. But that is where most of the power is, and it's not being used. But there are people out there like myself, like yourself, that are more aware of that and are willing to offer that type of service to people, because the other is immediate gratification. Most people want immediate gratification. They don't want to actually take command and take responsibility for their own reality. The few that do will pay the price and master their life. The majority are just wanting a quick fix and wanting immediate gratification. And those individuals will go from one drug to the next or one treatment to the next, searching for something that's not going to be obtainable.
Hey, John, as a final point, this has been absolutely fantastic, and I'm sure a lot of people are going to find tremendous value in this. Can you just kind of review just a few models of healthcare, psychiatric care, psychological care, like just these existing models that you feel are antiquated, inaccurate, outdated, and starting with, for example, health and the symptom model?
Well, the desire for that which is unobtainable and the desire to avoid that which is unavoidable is the source of human suffering, said the Buddha. There's a lot of wisdom in that. This was espoused almost the same time in the Greek philosophers Heraclitus and Parmenides, both of them. And they said you can't separate the pairs of opposites. So trying to get one side without the other is futile. It's like trying to get a nice person without a mean side. It's not going to happen. If you support my values, I'm nice as a pussycat. You challenge my values, I can be mean as a tiger, and so can everybody else. So searching for a one-sided thing is futile. But guess what we've been taught all our life? Our grandmother says, now be nice, don't be mean, be kind, don't be cruel, be positive, don't be negative, be generous, don't be stingy, be considerate, don't be inconsiderate, right? Be peaceful, don't be wrathful. And then she goes and beats up grandpa and yells at grandpa and demands grandpa to pay for things, etc. So moral hypocrisies drive most sources of illness in my observation. Moral hypocrisies. And the majority of people, moral hypocrisies sell to the amygdala, where most people function from. They're in survival. They're not in self-actualizing states. The majority of people, that's less than 1%. Majority of people are in gradations of surviving, getting by, not living a full inspired life and designing their life. They're living by duty instead of design. As a result of those moral hypocrisies, you have a false expectation. And this is unfulfilling. And therefore, when it goes, it becomes more vicious cycle, and you become more into the amygdala, and you want more immediate gratification. And then you expect the world to be peaceful without war, or be kind without cruel. And it's not going to happen. And people, they go, what do you mean? Don't blow my fantasy. Don't shake up my fantasy. That's my fantasy. And then the politicians and religious people sell them the fantasy. There's a great little video clip that you go on there. It says, it's a priest that says no hell. Good little video. Priest says no hell. Yeah. And he basically says that religions are in the guilt-producing control business. And most people don't realize that politics and religion that's what they're for. They basically sell you an ideal. And if you do it, you're going to get a reward. If you don't, you're going to get a punishment. And so they sell you the fantasy of the reward. They sell you the nightmare of the punishment. And so, I better be obedient little person. And I must beat myself up because I'm failing of achieving what my fantasy is. And that moral hypocrisy and fantasy leads to unrealistic expectations and self-defeat and self-depreciation. And therefore, people, to feel better about themselves, they live vicariously through other people's brands. They become consumers, they become drugs, they overeat sweets. They're looking for anything that gives them immediate gratification to the amygdala to compensate for it. And they don't realize that that's only because they've been taught false data. The Nobel Prize winner Paul Dirac said, it's not that we don't know so much, it's that we know so much that isn't so. We have more misinformation than true information. And we really saw that during COVID. The mass misinformation campaigns around the world are unbelievable. And people were falling for them left and right. And this is the underlying fantasy of one side without the other, a hero without a villain, is the source of a lot of human suffering.
Right. And this is happening with adults, but particularly the vulnerable, the teens, right, where they don't really have their prefrontal cortex developed. They have their overactive hormonal systems that are
their amygdala is running wild. Yes. From puberty to 25, your amygdala is running wild, and you're irrational. Any parent that's had a teenager knows that unless they found their mission and their real purpose at a young age and are targeting it and developing it, those individuals develop the executive center way earlier. There are 10, 12-year-olds that are developing an executive center already, the medial prefrontal cortex, because they know what their purpose is. I've met a gentleman that wanted to be one of the great violinists who at age 3 started doing violin. By the time he was 15, he was doing around the world concerts. He's now 30, I think. And he's done enormous. He's practiced 50,000 hours of the violin. 50,000 hours he's put into the violin. And he's got executive function, fine cortical spinal tract refinement of motor skills. His advanced part of his brain is working. It started very young because he knew what he wanted. But most people are wandering around living vicariously through other people's brains, through social media, and buying other people's brains to make them feel better about themselves. They're lost. They don't know who they are. And they're basically being run by all the moral hypocrisies. But if you actually find out what's really inspiring to you and get to your highest value at a very young age, you can actually develop that forebrain and gain self-governance at a young age and not go through the crazies that most teens go through.
Fantastic. Any parting final words?
I'll use an example. When I was 16, 17 years old, I lived on the North Shore of Oahu at Iikai Beach Park, right in front of Pipeline and Iikai Beach Park and gas chambers and Rocky Point in that area and Backdoor, right where one of the best surf spots in the world is. And there was another kid that was abandoned on the beach by his mom. He was between 6 and 7 years old. He was abandoned on the beach. I used to see him down on the beach. I slipped up in the park because I was living in the park at the time. And that kid, all of a sudden, Bill Hamilton, a famous surfer who lived 2 or 3 doors down, saw him on the beach, sleeping on the beach at night and in the morning. And went down there, started talking to him, took him in, started feeding him, took him on, found his mom who abandoned him, talked her into reestablishing it, married her, and he went on at a very young age, starting at 7, he started being trained in surfing and became one of the greatest surfers in the world. And he had executive function in surfing by the time he was 8, 9 already. I watched him surfing Pipeline in 2 years of the training by a master and becoming friends with all the top surfers. I watched that kid do something that was absolutely off the rocket. I mean, off the charts in surfing by age 8. And he was very methodical and very governed and didn't go into the wild, crazies, teenage stuff that most kids did, because he got guidance and he got clear about what his mission was at a young age. That's why I spend so much time trying to do that for people, no matter what the age, but particularly for the younger people, because if they get that, they save themselves enormous amounts of distractions and impulses and instincts and a lot of the baggage that most people are trapped in later on in their life.
Fantastic. I know you're tight for time, and I so appreciate you taking the time to do this. Can't wait to have you back in the Emirates. We spent a lot of time together this trip, so I really look forward to the opportunity of getting your method, the Demartini method, and getting your wisdom into the hearts and minds of the people here in the UAE. And yeah, I just want to say thank you again.
Thank you. Thanks for our time together and today, our little dialogue we had, because some people will be shocked by what we said, but others will be invigorated by it. And if you're shocked, learn about it. It'll change your life.
100%. Fantastic. So John, I'll just stop the recording now. We can cut it. We'll edit this stuff out, and we'll be able to finish off here.